aš galiu visus nuraminti, kad galima reflektuoti lietuviškai, nes yra Milda šalia ir išversti į anglų kalbą. Jauskitės laisvai, nevaržykite savęs. Mes truputį pareflektavom grupėje. Aš tai norėčiau galbūt dar truputį ir pats nuo savęs pridėti. Nežinau, kas kiek žinote, bet praeiti metai Lietuvoje buvo muziejų metai. Ir klausimas, kiek švietimas šiandien dienai yra prisidėjęs prie muziejų metų švietimo ir kiek švietimas atėjo į muziejus arba muziejai atėjo į švietimą. Ir praktiškai ištisi metai buvo muziejų metai, kur aktualizuota šita tema buvo. Dar smagiau, kad iš tikrųjų yra muziejininkų asociacijos, muziejai labai aktyvūs, jie rašo edukacinės programas, jie bendrauja su, gaila, kad kol kas nesistemiškai jau pavieniai, tik tai su kai kuriom mokyklom. Ir yra Europos parama, kur rengiamos irgi edukacinės programos, kartu su pedagogais, su ekspertais ir tikrai šiandien dienai muziejai turi labai daug atsinaujinusio turinio ir veiklos, bet jeigu taip suskaičiavus pasižiūrėjus, pokyčio tokio didelio tikrai neatsitiko, taip ir nesuartėjo. Čia mano subjektyviu manymu tos veiklos ir taip ir mes, žinau, teko dalyvauti diskusijų prezidentūroje apibendrinant muziejų metus, tai praktiškai taip dar ir diskutavom. Tai vis tik, kaip tam muziejui įrodyti mokytojui, kad ten verta ateiti su mokiniais ir kaip vėlgi tam mokytojui prisikviesti arba įrodyti muziejams, kad edukacijai, jų ten tos ekspozicijos ir edukacinės programos nelabai tinka. Ir ta diskusija amžina vyksta. Bet ką aš, jeigu taip jau dabar atsakant į klausimus, ką Polas paminėjo, ką man asmeniškai, kas buvo labai, labai įdomu ir ką mes grupėje truputį padiskutavom, kad iš tikrųjų daug dalykų mes turime Lietuvoje, bet kartais nemokam iš tų dalykų išgryninti tos edukacinės naudos vertės. Ir dažnu atveju mes kitą kartą į tą klausimą, vis tik kodėl mes čia arba ką mes darome, pritrūksta laiko mums pareflektuoti, gal dėl to, kad gyvenimas mūsų kai tą ratelį. Ir tikrai muziejai turi daug. Bet ką aš galbūt man tikrai patiko, kad šiandien dienai, pavyzdžiui, mes šnekam apie kompetencijas, apie visą kitą ir ką išgirdau, mokymas klausyti, arba mokymas būti, arba mokymas žiūrėti. Taip? Ir čia gal ir yra atsakymas to dialogo tarp muziejų ir mokytojų, kad vis tik muziejuje geresnės sąlygos ir aplinkos būtent stebėti, klausyti, įsižiūrėti. Mes ir ten paskui pradėjom diskutuoti, čia galima jau eiti ir iki tolerancijos, kad praktiškai vaikai pavaikšto po muziejų, vienas pastebi spalvas, kitas formas, trečias garsus, ketvirtas iš vis kažkokius vaizdus. Ir jeigu taip, profesionaliai suėjus į grupę reflektuojant, ten tikrai galima išgauti labai daug edukacinės naudos. Ir šiuo atveju yra tas svarbu. Ir dar kas man čia asmeniškai galbūt iškliuvo, tai tikrai patiko ta pirmoji nuotrauka, kada vaikas nufotografuotas. Ir iš tikrųjų mes irgi neišnaudojam tos galimybės. Yra daug pavyzdžių, kur ten pastato vienoje vietoje fotoaparatą arba kamerą ir filmuoja žmonių veidus. Ir po to tas visas rinkinys tų veidų yra didelis. Ir čia gal tikrai galima būtų kažkur muziejuose ar kažkur įrangą kažkokią turėti, kur tų laimingų arba susimaščiusių arba diskutuojančių arba galima įvairiais pjūviais, įvairiom kompetencijom turėti rinkinius tų mūsų moksleivių, mokinių arba mokytojų. Ir tai būtų geriau negu kad koks lankstinukas, kur parašyta ten kokios edukacinės programos arba kas naudinga ugdymo procesui, būtent tokie koliažai tų veidų susimaščiusių arba bediskutuojančių veidų. Tai tikrai aš galbūt vėlgi, čia galima būtų daugiau diskutuoti, bet kvieščiau tikrai galbūt įsijungti į tą diskusiją, nes matau ir iš kūrybinių partnerysčių žmonių yra, iš muziejų, tai drąsiai. Taip, drąsiai, ačiū Jums labai ir manau, dar minčių turėsite.
Norėčiau pasakyti vieną dalyką, confession, prisipažinti. Jūs pervertėte tikėjimą vienu dalyku, manas Kolardai. Jūs pasakėte tokį faktą, Ar aš teisingai supratau? Ir dabar man ateina supratimas, gal mes ir mokyklas modeliavome, tarsi pasaulio sumažintą, suvaikintą, suinfantilintą modelį, kuris iš tikrųjų nėra toks nuoširdžiai įdomus vaikams, ir kad tikroji mokykla yra su tikrais daiktais, su tikrom bibliotekom, su tikrais faktais muziejuose, kad iš tikrųjų šito modelio, pseudo mokymosi modelio, aš negaliu pasakyti pseudo, bet šitoje vietoje aš išeinu iš vaiko požiūrio. Vadinasi, jis išaugo. Vaikai yra, ir su tuo dera vieno dėstytojo pasakyta mintis, kai jisai bandydavo vesti ekskursiją arba paskaitą vaikams. Ir iš pradžių sako, pirmą kartą bandžiau su jais kalbėti kaip su vaikais, mažybiniais žodeliais, žodžiu visais va tokiais. Ir labai greitai suprato, kad vaikai yra lygiaverčiai, pašnekovai ir supratėjai, kaip ir visi suaugę žmonės. Tai va šitoj vietoj jūs spragtelėjote ir aš supratau, kad iš tikrųjų viskas turi išeiti į tikrinį gyvenimą. Ačiū.
Hello. I just like to say one thing. When I was thinking about this issue about museums and libraries, I was thinking that should I tell teacher that we should go to the museum because of the importance of art as itself. So today I was quite surprised because now I'm thinking not about about art as itself as a value, but also about how to explore these spaces, these objects, these contexts also. So just my impression. And could you say just maybe you could say a little bit more about what can we find in the museum more? Not only in concepts, contexts, real objects, spaces, authentic objects. What else? Time, spaces. I have already written everything.
You raised this very interesting question about art for art's sake. I think the challenge for children, young people, but also for a lot of adults, is they won't understand art for art's sake because you tell them. They have to experience it. And you have to create a starting place for the journey that they're going to go on. And my experience is that if you create the right starting place on the journey, they will, at the end, come to understand art for art's sake as well, through their engagement with it over a period of time. And quite often, and we have this debate in England a lot, where people go, but isn't this instrumentalizing, is the word they use, art, and my argument is no. It's when you start with a reason for engaging with the artwork, like the take one picture, and you do it from all those different dimensions. I think that's when you eventually begin to understand why art is so special. But it's through a journey. It's not through someone giving you a message. And so I think that's key. Something I didn't mention about museums and libraries is museums and libraries are full of feelings. And very often the feelings are left quite hidden. And in the same way that I'm arguing we have to create more space for acknowledging feeling in school, then actually feelings is a very big thing that can be explored in libraries and museums. And when thinking about how you design exhibits is being much more upfront. I wrote an article recently for one of our newspapers because the government in England, who I don't approve of, they had published a report on cultural education, and it had an introduction by the minister, and he said, I think arts is a very good subject in education because it has a history that can be studied and it has techniques that you could learn to play musical instruments, so it's technical. And he says that knowledge and technique is what makes great education. And I wrote the article and I said, I think he's completely misunderstood education, but he's also completely misunderstood art. I think it is very interesting to know the history of paintings, to understand the place that it fits. But that's not why it works. I listen to a piece of music not to know another piece of music by a composer because of the way it makes me feel. And I think arts and literature are all about how you feel, and you can't begin to deal with them unless you're willing to open yourself up to that. And therefore, I think that libraries and museums can really help schools create the spaces in which feelings are acknowledged and become part of what you do. Again, in Western Australia, it had a big exhibit of Aboriginal art in there. And when we had this discussion, we went and looked at it. It was very clear that the most important thing about the art is how it makes you feel. But actually, it was the least discussed part of what went on in the exhibit, if you see what I mean. It was all trying to turn it into history and that kind of thing. Thank you.
Sveiki. Turėčiau keletą trumpų klausimų lektoriai. Pirmas klausimas būtų, ar kūrybinių partnerysčių projektas Jungtinėje karalystėje kaip nors susijęs su dokumentu All Our Future? Kiek metų trunka projektas Jungtinėje karalystėje?
Okay, so the history was in 1997 we had a general election and the Labour Party came in, and the Labour Party, as one of their first things, asked Ken Robinson to have a look at education and creativity, and the result was All Our Futures, which was published in 1999. The great thing about Ken Robinson is he has wonderful ideas, but he's never actually done anything. He's never implemented anything. So the big question was, we like these ideas, who's going to try and implement them? And after much discussion, that became Creative Partnerships. So Creative Partnerships was the British government's attempt to implement the All Our Futures ideas. So that's what we did. We tried to do.
Ar mano žinios teisingos, kad po štai to dokumento paminėto All Our Future buvo tikrai skirtos nemažos lėšos kūrybinėm partnerystėm startuoti Jungtinėje karalystėje?
Yes.
Ar jūsų projektas kaip nors bendradarbiauja su kitu žinomu projektu, bent man žinomu projektu, manau ir kitiems, Room 13? Kambarys 13, Room 13.
Yes. It took the government some time to move from All Our Futures to launching the programme. So the programme wasn't launched until 2002. It was launched with £20 million a year, which is about 22 million euros a year, but it then grew to about 45 million euros a year over the years that it was operating. That allowed us to work in around 2,500 schools a year, which was 10% of schools in England. And we thought that that was a good percentage to start bringing around change in the system, that there was a good relationship. And the Creative Partnerships programme here was modelled on the same idea, that you try and work with around 10% of schools. After the general election in 2010 and the financial crisis in the UK, the government cut the funding for Creative Partnerships. But we've been visiting a lot of Creative Partnerships schools recently, and it's very impressive to see the way they have embedded the learning in the school in the long term. So although we no longer financially support the schools, what we can see in all the schools I've visited is they now find money from their own budgets to bring artists and other creative professionals into the schools and to teach in that way right away across the school. And it's very impressive, and I like that. And just on Room 13, yes, in the way that we operate, schools would identify an issue, and we would then develop a project which would deal with that issue. We did quite a lot of Room 13s, because it's a very interesting model. So we'd look at the issue and say, well, a Room 13 model would work quite well for you. And in Room 13, what happens is that the school will give, these are primary schools, will give the children one of the classrooms which the children will manage completely themselves. And they have a budget to employ an artist to work in that space, but they work for the children and do what the children want. It's a space in which the children are in charge, they manage behaviour and other things like that, and they are, if they are, so long as they are up to date with their work, they're allowed to go to Room 13 at any time during the school day. So it opens up a big space for children to be self-managing. And it has a very powerful effect in schools as a program.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much for the presentation. I enjoyed it very much, and I got even the question before you started, before you arrived, and it's based on structures. We talk a lot about schools, what should change and how do we imagine change in schools, but if we look at structures where it's born, let's say take this room, it looks quite conservative, hierarchical, old, and all those things, and then you take the other side of the building, so that's where it all starts, and then you take the end goal, which is, for example, Vilnius University, which is also old, conservative, hierarchical structures. And if we open like those, like the role of the teacher, the workshop classroom and everything, and you see that we want to implement things in the classroom, but everywhere around we get the opposite. We get the opposite on how things work in the Ministry of Education, we get the opposite in the university, in the parliament. So how do we deal with change? How do we play it from other sides? And I want to include about the end goal. We want to include creativity, group work, projects, and all those things. But the end goal is the grade 10. The end goal is the university. The end goal is a guided job. The end goal is expectations, freedom and so on. So, do you follow where my questions? How do we play with those things, and how do we start working from different levels? Thank you.
I think, as I look at different education the world are changing and are trying to change. And the problem, and I can certainly see this very clearly in England, is teachers have more freedom and flexibility than they know how to use. And the problem is trying to provide them with the support and training to learn how to use it. Yes, of course, there's still traditional structures and other things within education, and really the push is for more flexibility for teachers and more freedom. But as somebody in the Ministry of Education in France said to me, it's much easier to forbid than to allow. And I think there's quite a lot of allowing happening now. But people don't take the permission in the room because it's scary, actually. To have more freedom is frightening. And it also means doing things differently. And therefore, I think on the whole, it's how do we build the capacity of teachers to make the most of their new flexibility is probably the bigger challenge at the moment. That's also to do with some of the dynamics in schools, but certainly some of the projects that I've seen and some of the discussions I've had in Lithuanian schools, like that, just that simple story of the listening project, shows that there's the scope for teaching very, very differently at the moment. It is possible. The head teacher in that school director was very supportive, was very excited. They were all thinking, we can do this, we can do this, and it was all beginning to bubble up as a school. So I don't think the principal worry is the structures remaining very hierarchical at the moment. The principal worry is teachers having the confidence to make the use of the flexibilities that they have. The question about then there's university and then there's jobs. I think this is very interesting, and I think there are some contradictions here. Employers, when they are surveyed, and this is true in all the developed world, says we want very creative, unusual, imaginative employees. We need it for the future. And they know it's true, and they say it, but it's not what they do. And there is still a problem of them not matching their recruitment policies actually to their ambitions there. So, if you take, say, the big international consultancies like Pricewaterhouse or Ernst & Young and so forth, who pay very well, recruit top people and so forth, and there's a lot of competition to work for them. They will say, we want creative, different, so on and so forth, things, but it's not who they recruit. They recruit traditional people from traditional universities who've done traditional subjects. So I think they know it's wrong, but they're not changing. So there's the rhetoric on the one side, and then there's the practice. But the other more fundamental change in employment for me is this thing that I often say, which is actually young people coming out of university today have to invent their own jobs. That's what's different from before. In the old days, you came out, there was a factory, you'd advertise for jobs, you applied. Well, the factory's gone, and nobody's advertising. But there are jobs if you invent them. You see at the moment, right across Europe, high levels of unemployment, but it's hugely on young people. Because young people are coming out and are competing for the jobs which already exist, which they can't have because there are people in them. And the new jobs they have to create, no one else has invented them for them. And that's the big challenge there. And the question is, how do you give young people the skills to invent their own jobs in the future? And you can see some young people do it really successfully, but other people don't. But when national plans say we have to stimulate more entrepreneurialism, what they mean is we've got to stimulate more job creation. We need people to invent jobs and to make them really successful jobs. And the main responsibility on that is on young people. So you've got to think of jobs differently.
Hello, my name is Rebecca. I'm a PhD student and I'm interested in museum, and I have some comments about teaching and learning in the museum. What do you think? What is best, teaching or learning? And how I think museum is not the same as school. They don't try to copy school. And I think in Lithuania, museums still are from children. They are still boring, they are not smart learning institution. So how we can help for teachers and museum educators to do some challenges and changes in museum? Maybe we can give more hands-on task and mind-on task, or we can just give some more task about reflection, and maybe we can look to children not like from school groups, but self-directed and self-managing position. Can you suggest some methods or forms how to do the best way to work in museums in Lithuania?
I think your point about teaching and learning is very important. I was talking to the director of one of our big municipalities in England, Essex County Council, which has 600 schools, so this is a big municipality. And he said to me, when I go to a school, which is in difficulty, I always find the same problem, but in different forms. And the problem is too much teaching and not enough learning. And schools, as they get into trouble, can go into teaching overdrive. But actually, the point is learning. And teaching is useful, in a sense, only to the extent to which it facilitates learning. I've heard teachers say to me, I'm teaching, why aren't they learning? And you think, you've got to think about this. So the learning, to me, is the only point you're interested in learning. How do you develop learning in young people? And not only how do you develop learning specific to the subject that they're studying, but how do you always encourage them to learn, if you see what I mean? Because the thing they can actually do for the rest of their life is learn. Whatever happens, they're going to be learning. That's the nature of the world. So it's this absolute focus on learning the whole time. As a mechanism, first of all, comparing museums and schools, I think traditionally museums taught very much as schools taught, which is here's a lot of knowledge, read it, now you know, if you see what I mean, and less concerned with learning, more with teaching. I think museums are changing and they become more and more interested in learning. But I think a very good way of starting this would be for museum staff to go into schools and watch young people learning and think about that and then take that back into how they design and run their museums. And work with teachers to understand learning better, because they're teachers who are very good at learning. And if you sit in the classroom and watch and think about and reflect, I think you'll bring back a very different practice into your museum once you start focusing on learning. But as Milda said, we were talking in the break about the really important thing is to build a better dialogue between museums and schools. That I think the starting point would be for a museum person just to go and spend a day at school, talk to teachers, sit in class, watch learning, see what's going on. And I think you'd come back with lots of ideas of things you could do just from the experience of sitting in the classroom thinking, oh, I've got something out there, I can do that, I can do that. But similarly, teachers ought to come and spend a day in the library of the museum. Just looking at it from that point of view. Even one day, I think, would start stimulating a lot of ideas. And if every museum person, just in the next few weeks, picked a teacher and said, I come visit me, you come visit me, then we have a conversation, I think lots of things would happen really quickly to make it do. But the key point is the one you raised. It's about learning. It's all about learning. What makes learning most effective? One of the things worth adding, obviously, is that different children learn in different ways, which makes it complicated. And therefore, the way in which you operate has to allow for different learning styles, but always focus on learning.
Where you are not obliged to learn. And I think that the most potential of libraries are more known to me myself, is to promote self-motivated, self-directed learning. And here I would like also to pay our attention that there are more players in learning than only schools, museums and libraries. And libraries, and I believe museums as well, can help to introduce all those players as for instance, artists or non-governmental organization or community organization into that learning field. And there is a number of projects where library became a space for collaboration of these different actors, and where children came to learn what they wanted to learn themselves, not because they have to learn this at school. And the library was a kind of mediator, as an organizer, where, for instance, artists were a kind of volunteers that had a space in the library, that had tools, technology or anything else. And library became that informal space because, well, actually, I think that anyway, school is a place of formal learning, and independently of your grading system, still you have this curriculum, you have this competition among pupils and a kind of obligation. At the library, you are not, and you can initiate your learning path yourself. So I would like to speak about how other stakeholders or other actors can take a role in those learning processes.
Absolutely. The work you describe you doing sounds fantastic, and that's brilliant. That's exactly what I'd like to see libraries everywhere do. I think what I'm arguing is that I absolutely buy the fact that it's a space for informal learning and self-directed learning. But the driver in school is actually to teach young people to become self-directed learners. That is what they should need to do. And therefore, the connection I see to informal education in the library space is that and I think what I argue in my examples is that libraries are places for self-directed learning, but what you want to do is to take the learning about learning back into the other kind of learning, because that's what we need to teach young people to do. If you teach people in such a way that they only know how to do directed learning, they don't learn. In the long term, you're not laying the foundations for them being successful in employment or university. So I see libraries as being a place for informal, self-directed learning, but that you are learning about self-directed learning and you're then able to take it back and apply it to other areas of learning. Not that it should stay separate.
Tai tada labai turiu knygos ir noriu padėkoti visiems už dalyvavimą, už klausimą. Čia, aišku, tiesiog mūsų pastanga buvo pasiūlyti